The rain in London did not just fall, it reclaimed the city. It slicked the cobblestones of Mayfair and turned the neon lights of Soho into blurred, bleeding smears of crimson and gold. It was November 14th, 2024, and the air carried a biting chill that seeped through the most expensive wool coats. Inside a blacked-out vehicle idling near a private club, Arthur Sterling sat in a silence so thick it felt heavy. Arthur was 32 years old, with a jawline that looked as though it had been carved from the very limestone of the city's oldest cathedrals. His eyes were the color of the Thames under a storm cloud, a deep, turbulent grey that rarely betrayed a single emotion. To the rest of the world, he was the kingpin of a sophisticated empire that moved everything from high-end real estate to the more shadowed commodities of the city. He was respected, feared, and utterly untouchable. But inside the sanctuary of his own chest, he was a man living in a self-imposed prison. It had been exactly 365 days since he had felt the warmth of a woman's skin against his own. His mind drifted back to a different rainy night, July 20th, 2023. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room had been suffocating. His mother, Margaret, the only person who had ever truly known the boy behind the monster, had gripped his hand with a strength that defied her frailty. Her voice had been a raspy whisper, one that still echoed in his dreams. "Arthur," she had said, her eyes searching his, "your father used women like currency. He died wealthy but hollow. Promise me you won't be him. Promise me you won't touch another soul until your heart is the one leading your hands. Wait for the love that makes you feel human again." He had kissed her knuckles and given his word. Since that moment, he had moved through the world like a ghost. He attended the galas, he sat in the VIP booths of the loudest clubs, and he watched the most beautiful women in Europe try to catch his eye. They would brush against his arm, their perfume expensive and cloying, but he would simply adjust his cufflinks and look right through them. He was a man of his word, and his word was iron. On this particular night, the car door opened, and his lead security detail, a man named Elias, nodded toward the entrance of the Obsidian. The club was one of Arthur's many holdings, a place where the elite came to sin in the dark. "The meeting is set, Mr. Sterling," Elias murmured. Arthur stepped out, the rain instantly matting his dark hair. He didn't use an umbrella. He liked the cold. It reminded him he was alive. He walked into the club, the heavy bass of the music vibrating in his marrow. The scent was a mixture of expensive tobacco, spilled gin, and the underlying musk of 1,000 dancing bodies. He moved through the crowd like a shark through a reef, effortless and dangerous. People parted for him without a word being spoken. He took his seat in the high-walled booth that overlooked the entire floor. From here, he could see the greed, the lust, and the desperation of the city. He sipped a glass of neat scotch, the liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. His associates were talking about shipment routes and local authorities, but Arthur's focus shifted. That was when he saw her. She wasn't on the dance floor, nor was she sitting in a booth draped in designer labels. She was standing near the long marble bar, holding a simple glass of water. She looked like a splash of white paint on a black canvas. She wore a simple high-necked dress that hugged a silhouette of soft curves and lean muscle. Her hair was a deep chestnut brown, pulled back in a way that exposed the elegant line of her throat. She looked out of place. She didn't have the hungry look of the other patrons. She looked like she was waiting for someone, her eyes darting toward the door with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. Arthur felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in over a decade. It wasn't just the aesthetic perfection of her face, though she was breathtaking. It was a pull, an invisible tether that seemed to snap into place the moment his eyes landed on her. For the first time in 1 year, the ice around his heart didn't just crack, it shattered. He watched her move. She shifted her weight, the fabric of her dress straining slightly against her hip, and Arthur felt his breath hitch. He found himself tracing the curve of her shoulder with his eyes, imagining the texture of her skin. The thought of his mother's promise flared in his mind, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a restraint. It felt like a countdown, reaching 0. The woman turned her head, and for a fleeting second her gaze swept across the VIP balcony. Arthur didn't move. He didn't blink. He felt the heat radiating from his own body, a physical fire that the Scotch couldn't quench. He was a predator who had finally found the only thing in the world he couldn't live without. "Arthur?" one of his associates asked, noticing his silence. "Is there a problem with the numbers?" Arthur didn't look at the man. He didn't even put down his glass. He simply raised a hand, silencing the table. His grey eyes remained locked on the woman by the bar. He watched a man approach her, some low-level dealer trying his luck. He saw her politely decline, her expression firm but weary. The man reached out to grab her arm, and Arthur's hand tightened around his glass so hard the crystal groaned. Elias, sensing the shift in his boss's energy, leaned in close. "Sir?" Arthur's voice was a low growl, vibrating with an authority that brooked no argument. It was the sound of a man who had decided to change the course of his life in a single heartbeat. "The woman in the white dress," Arthur said, his gaze never wavering. "By the bar. She's being bothered." Elias looked down, his hand already moving toward his jacket. "Shall we remove the man, sir?" Arthur finally turned his head, looking at his lieutenant. There was a hunger in Arthur's eyes that made even Elias, a man who had seen battlefields, take a half-step back. It wasn't just anger, it was possession. "Remove the man," Arthur ordered, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "And then bring her to me. Do not frighten her, but make it clear that she is not to leave this building with anyone but my men." Elias nodded and signaled to two other guards. As they descended the stairs, Arthur turned back to the window. He watched as his men intercepted the harasser, whisking him away into the shadows of the hallway. Then he watched Elias approach the woman. She looked startled, her hand flying to her chest as Elias spoke to her. She looked up at the balcony, searching for the person who had sent him. Their eyes met across the distance of the crowded club. Arthur stood up, his tall frame cutting a silhouette of absolute power against the dim lights. He didn't smile. He simply watched her, waiting to see if she would run or if she would follow. She hesitated for 3 long seconds. Then, slowly, she nodded to Elias. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made his fingertips tingle. The year of silence was over. As she began to walk toward the stairs, guided by his men, Arthur realized he didn't even know her name, yet he knew he would never let her go. The air in the VIP lounge was thin, filtered by expensive ventilation systems that stripped away the smell of the sweat and desperation from the club floor below. As Elena walked up the plushly carpeted stairs, she felt the eyes of the guards on her back, not lecherous but clinical, as if they were measuring her for a coffin or a throne. She was 24 years old, a daughter of the London streets who had spent her life trying to stay invisible. Her father had been a gambler who left nothing but debts, and her mother was a woman whose spirit had been crushed by the weight of 3 jobs. Eleanor worked as a junior archivist, a job that required patience and silence, 2 things she was currently using to keep her knees from shaking. She had come to the Obsidian to meet a contact who promised information about her brother's mounting debts, but instead, she found herself walking into the lair of the city's most dangerous man. When she reached the top of the stairs, the guards stepped aside. Arthur Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his back to the room. He was taller than he had appeared from the bar, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light of the city. "You can leave us," Arthur said. His voice was like velvet over gravel, a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air she breathed. Elias and the others vanished into the shadows without a sound. Elena stood in the center of the room, her fingers digging into the palms of her hands. "I didn't come here to be summoned," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was told this was a public establishment." Arthur turned slowly. In the dim, amber light of the lounge, his face was a study in shadows and sharp angles. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a dark prince. His grey eyes swept over her, not with the typical greed she was used to from men in places like this, but with a terrifying, focused intensity. It felt as though he were reading her pulse. "It is my establishment," Arthur replied, taking a slow step toward her, "and you were being harassed. I don't care for disorder in my house." "I could have handled him," she countered, lifting her chin. Arthur stopped just 2 feet away from her. The heat radiating from him was palpable, a physical force that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. For Arthur, the proximity was almost agonizing. The scent of her, something like vanilla and rain, filled his lungs, a sharp contrast to the stale air of his isolated life. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to reach out, to see if her skin was as soft as it looked, to feel the heartbeat he could see fluttering at the base of her throat. But the memory of his mother's cold hand in his, dated July 20th, 2023, acted like a lead weight on his soul. Wait for the love that makes you feel human. "I'm sure you could have," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "But I found I didn't want to watch it. What is your name?" "Elena," she whispered, her resolve softening under the weight of his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, that she hadn't expected. "Elena," he repeated, the name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. "You are in trouble, not with the man at the bar, but with the people your brother owes. Word travels fast in my circles." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know about that?" "I know everything that happens in this city, Elena, especially when it involves someone who looks like they don't belong in the dark." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face. He could feel the warmth of her cheek, the static electricity between them crackling in the small space. His fingers trembled slightly, a rare show of weakness. He wanted to trace the curve of her lip, to pull her into him and break the vow that had become his shadow. Instead, he curled his fingers into a fist and dropped his hand. "You aren't safe in your apartment tonight," Arthur said, his tone suddenly businesslike, though his eyes remained hungry. "My men have already seen scouts from the Valenti family watching your door. They think you are leverage." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The Valentis were known for their brutality. "I have to go. I have to get my mother." "My men are already there," Arthur interrupted. "They are moving her to a safe house, and you are coming with me." "To a safe house?" "To my home," he corrected. The drive to the Sterling estate was a blur of rain and silence. Arthur sat in the back of the Bentley with her, but he kept a deliberate space between them. He stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle in his neck stood out. Eleanor watched him, her mind racing. She should have been terrified, but the way he had looked at her, as if she were the only solid thing in a world of ghosts, made her feel a strange sense of belonging. They arrived at the estate as the clock of the city would have neared midnight, though time felt irrelevant here. The house was a massive, sprawling structure of stone and glass, hidden behind iron gates and high walls. Inside, the floors were cold marble, and the walls were lined with art that cost more than Elena would earn in 10 lifetimes. "This is a cage," Elena said as they stood in the grand foyer. "A gilded one," Arthur agreed, finally looking at her. He began to unbutton his overcoat, his movements slow and deliberate. "But it is the only place in London where they cannot touch you." He stepped closer, closing the gap between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. The silence of the house was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Arthur looked down at her, his grey eyes darkening until they were almost black. The physical pull was like a riptide, dragging him under. He wanted to tell her about the promise. He wanted to tell her that for the first time in 365 days, he felt like he was waking up from a coma. "I told you, Elena," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "I don't like disorder. And seeing you out there, unprotected, it felt like a flaw in the world." He reached out again, and this time he didn't stop. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, a light, fleeting contact that sent a shockwave through both of them. It was the first time he had touched a woman in a year, and the sensation was overwhelming. Her lips were soft, slightly parted in surprise, and the heat of her breath against his skin made his head swim. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut. She felt the power in him, the sheer raw strength of a man who could crush her, but chose to hold his breath instead. Arthur's hand slid to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of her hair. He pulled her a fraction closer, until their chests were almost touching, He could feel the soft weight of her breasts pressing against his suit jacket, and the friction sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire through his veins. He wanted to kiss her until the world disappeared. He wanted to forget his mother, forget the city, and forget the blood on his hands. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the fear beneath the curiosity. He saw the girl who had been forced into his world by circumstance, not choice. With a jagged breath, he stepped back, breaking the contact. The loss of her warmth felt like a physical wound. "Elias will show you to your room," Arthur said, his voice tight with the effort of self-control. "There are clothes in the wardrobe. Food will be brought to you." "Arthur," she started, but he was already turning away. "Sleep, Elena," he said, not looking back. "Tomorrow, the world will still be there. But for tonight, you are mine to protect." As he walked toward his study, Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had touched her. He had broken the physical seal of his vow, and yet he knew his heart wasn't leading his hands. Not yet. It was something deeper, something more volatile. He walked into his office and poured a drink, his hand shaking as the ice clinked against the glass. He didn't see the shadow moving in the garden outside, a silent observer watching the lights of the estate. The peace of the gilded cage was already being measured by those who wanted to see it burn. The morning of November 15th, 2024, arrived with a grey, suffocating fog that swallowed the sprawling gardens of the estate. Elena woke up in a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets that cost more than her entire life's savings. The room was massive, decorated in shades of charcoal and silver, reflecting the cold, disciplined soul of the man who owned it. She stood by the window, watching the mist roll over the manicured lawn. She felt like a character in a Gothic novel, the captive bride or the sacrificial lamb, but as she touched her lower lip, she could still feel the phantom heat of Arthur's thumb. It hadn't been an act of violence, it had been an act of recognition. Downstairs in the shadowed mahogany of the library, Arthur was not sleeping. He had spent the entire night staring at a portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in that sterile hospital room on July 20th, 2023. The sound of the heart monitor had been the only rhythm in the room. His mother's skin had been as pale as parchment. "Arthur," she had whispered, her fingers cold against his palm. "Love is not a weakness. It is the only thing that will keep the darkness from swallowing you whole. Don't waste yourself on women who want your name or your money. Wait for the one who sees the boy I raised. Promise me." He had promised, and for 1 year he had been a monk in a suit, a man who moved through a world of temptation without ever letting it touch him. He had thought the promise would be easy to keep because he didn't believe the woman his mother described actually existed, until he saw Elena. A light knock on the door broke his reverie. It was Elias. "She is awake, sir. She's exploring the gallery." Arthur stood, smoothing the front of his silk shirt. "Prepare a late breakfast in the conservatory, and Elias, make sure the perimeter is doubled. The Valentis are quiet, which means they are planning something." When Arthur entered the conservatory, he found Elena standing among the exotic ferns and glass walls. She was wearing a simple cream-colored silk robe that had been left in her wardrobe. The light caught the chestnut highlights in her hair, and for a moment Arthur forgot how to breathe. She looked fragile, yet defiant, a spark of life in his sterile museum of a home. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Elena turned, startled. The sight of him without his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars, made her heart race. He looked less like a businessman and more like a warrior at rest. "As well as I could, considering I'm being held by a man who thinks he owns the city," she replied, though there was no real bite in her tone. "I don't think I own it, Elena." "I know I do," he said, stepping closer. "Sit, you need to eat." They sat at a small marble table. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with the weight of things they weren't saying. Arthur watched her move, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the way her throat moved when she swallowed. Every movement was a torture of desire. As she reached for a glass of juice, Her hand brushed against his. The contact was brief, but it felt like a lightning strike. Arthur didn't pull away this time. He turned his hand over, catching her fingers in his. His skin was hot, his grip firm but strangely tender. Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked up, meeting his grey eyes, and saw the storm raging behind them. "You're shaking," Arthur murmured, his thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. He could feel her pulse jumping under his touch, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that matched his own. "You're a dangerous man, Arthur," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his lips. "I should be running as far away from here as possible." "And yet, you're still here," he said, his voice dropping to a predatory hum. He leaned across the table, his face inches from hers. The scent of her, that intoxicating mix of vanilla and warm skin, was driving him to the edge of his sanity. He slid his hand up her arm, his fingertips grazing the soft silk of her robe, feeling the heat of her body underneath. The friction created a slow burning fire that settled deep in his gut. Eleanor leaned into him, her lips parting. She wanted to feel that power again, to know if the man who ruled London with an iron fist could be soft for her. The air between them was electric, thick with a sensuality that threatened to break every vow he had ever made. Arthur's gaze dropped to the curve of her neck, where the robe had slipped slightly to reveal the creamy skin of her shoulder. He imagined pressing his mouth there, tasting her, marking her as his. His fingers tightened on her arm, his knuckles turning white. "1 year," he hissed almost to himself. "What?" she asked, her voice a breathless sigh. "Nothing," he said, abruptly pulling back. The rejection was sharp, leaving Elena cold and confused. He stood up, his face becoming a mask of stone once again. "I have business to attend to. You are free to move about the house, but do not go outside. The fog is thick, and the shadows are deeper than you know." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He didn't look back, but his voice was strained. "Eleanor, don't look at me like that. Not unless you're prepared for the consequences." As Arthur walked away, he felt the ghostly whispers of his mother's voice in his head. He was falling, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be saved. He headed toward his secure line, unaware that miles away in a basement filled with cigarette smoke, the Valenti brothers were looking at a photograph of Elena, realizing that Arthur Sterling had finally found his Achilles heel. By the evening of November 15th, 2024, the rain had returned, drumming a rhythmic, relentless beat against the high glass panes of the Sterling estate. Inside, the atmosphere was far from cold. Arthur had spent the afternoon away from the main house, dealing with the messy mechanics of his empire, but his mind had never truly left the conservatory. He could still feel the phantom heat of Elena's skin against his fingertips. When Elena returned to her suite after the midday meal, she found several boxes waiting for her on the velvet chaise lounge. There was no note, but she didn't need one. Inside were garments made of the finest silks and cashmeres, in deep emeralds, midnight blues, and a single dress of obsidian silk that felt like liquid moonlight. Beside them lay a small velvet case containing a necklace of delicate silver, holding a single, flawless, tear-shaped diamond. She didn't want to be a trophy, but as she ran her hand over the fabric, she realized these weren't just gifts. They were a message. Arthur was surrounding her with the things he was afraid to give her himself: softness, beauty, and value. The night had matured into a deep, velvety black when Arthur finally entered the drawing room. A fire was roaring in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. He stopped in the doorway, his breath hitching in his throat. Elena was standing by the fireplace, wearing the obsidian silk dress. It draped over her curves like a second skin, the low back exposing the elegant, vulnerable line of her spine. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling wood. She didn't turn around, but she could feel his presence. It was like a magnetic pull, tugging at the very core of her being. "I wanted to see you in something that matched your worth," Arthur replied. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped just behind her, so close that the heat of his body radiated against her bare back. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He simply stood there, breathing in the scent of her, which had become his favorite drug. The silence between them was thick, charged with 1,000 unspoken desires. "Tell me about the year, Arthur," she whispered, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were wide, searching his face. "You mentioned it today, 1 year, what happened?" Arthur's jaw tightened. The orange light of the fire danced in his grey eyes, making them look like molten steel. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. The contact was electric. Elena leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut as a low sigh escaped her lips. "I made a promise," Arthur said, his voice a ragged whisper. "A promise to a woman who saw the best in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. I swore I wouldn't touch a woman, wouldn't allow myself the comfort of another soul until it was real, until it wasn't just a transaction or a moment of weakness." He slid his hand down the side of her neck, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her head. He pulled her a fraction closer, his chest almost brushing against hers. Through the thin silk of her dress, she could feel the hard, unyielding lines of his body. The contrast between her softness and his strength was overwhelming. "And is this real?" she asked, her voice trembling. Arthur didn't answer with words. He leaned down, his lips hovering just a hair's breadth from hers. He could feel the warmth of her breath, the slight tremble of her lower lip. His other hand found the small of her back, his fingers splaying against the bare skin. The touch was possessive, desperate, and filled with a hunger that had been building for 365 days. He began to trail his mouth along the line of her throat, his lips grazing her skin with a feather-light touch that sent shivers racing down her spine. Elena gasped, her hands coming up to rest on his broad shoulders. She could feel the ripple of muscles under his shirt, the sheer power he was holding back just for her. His touch moved lower, his thumb tracing the delicate collarbone before dipping into the hollow of her throat. Every inch of skin he touched felt like it was catching fire. He was mapping her, learning the topography of her body with a reverence that made her feel cherished. "Elena," he groaned against her skin, the sound vibrating through her chest. He pulled her flush against him, his arms wrapping around her waist. The physical connection was staggering. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his own, a shared rhythm that seemed to bridge the gap between their two worlds. For a moment, the shadows of the room disappeared, and there was only the heat, the scent of the wood smoke, and the weight of her in his arms. He wanted to stay there forever. He wanted to lift her into his arms, carry her to the bed, and finally break the vow that had become his cross to bear. The desire was a physical ache, a pressure in his chest that threatened to boil over. But as his lips returned to the corner of her mouth, the image of his mother's face flashed in his mind. Wait for the love that makes you feel human again. Was this love? Or was it just the madness of a man who had been alone for too long? The doubt was like a douse of ice water. Arthur pulled back, his hands dropping from her body as if he had been burned. He turned away from her, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain his composure. "Arthur?" Elena asked, her voice filled with confusion and a lingering traces of the passion they had just shared. She reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away. "It's late," he said, his voice cold and distant, a sharp contrast to the fire he had just ignited. "The guards are on high alert. You should be in your room." "You do this every time," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "You get close, you make me feel something, and then you pull the shutters down. What are you afraid of?" Arthur turned back to her, his expression a mask of granite. "I'm not afraid of anything, Elena. I'm protecting you. From the world. And from me." "I don't need protection from you," she countered. "You don't know what I am," he hissed. "You don't know what I've done to keep this city under my thumb. You are a light in a very dark place, and I won't be the one to extinguish it." He walked toward the door, his silhouette tall and imposing. "Stay in your room, Elena. Don't come down again tonight." As he left, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, Elena sank onto the hearth rug. The warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the coldness that had just settled in the room. She looked into the flames, realizing that Arthur Sterling's promise was a wall she didn't know how to climb. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the hallway, Arthur leaned his head against the wall, his eyes closed. His hands were still shaking. He had almost broken. He had almost surrendered to the heat. He didn't see the light of a cell phone screen in the distance, where a traitor within his own house was sending a message. He's distracted. Tomorrow is the day. The morning of November 16th, 2024, broke with a deceptive stillness. The London fog had settled into a thick white shroud that clung to the trees and muffled the sound of the distant city traffic. Inside the estate, the silence was brittle. After the firelit confrontation of the previous night, the air between Arthur and Elena had become a live wire, humming with a frequency that threatened to shatter the glass walls of the conservatory. Arthur was in his surveillance hub, a room stripped of the home's usual elegance and replaced with the cold blue glow of 16 monitors. His eyes were bloodshot. He had spent the last several hours tracking the movements of the Valenti family. They were shifting assets toward the docks, a move that usually signaled a large-scale offensive. But something felt wrong. It was too loud, too obvious. "Elias," Arthur said into his headset, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. "The movements at the docks are a feint. They want us looking east. Pull the perimeter in now." Before Elias could respond, a low, muffled thud vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of thunder. It was the sound of a controlled breach. Arthur's instincts, honed by a decade of survival in the London underworld, took over. He grabbed the weapon from the underside of his desk and moved toward the main hall. His heart wasn't racing with fear. It was hammering with a singular, violent purpose. Eleanor. He found her in the library, standing paralyzed as the sound of glass shattering echoed from the foyer. Two men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by dark balaclavas, were already stepping through the ruins of the French doors. "Down!" Arthur roared. He didn't wait for her to move. He lunged across the room, his large frame colliding with hers as he tackled her behind the heavy mahogany desk. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp as they hit the floor. The scent of her, that same vanilla and rain, hit him even amidst the smell of gunpowder and ozone. The room erupted into chaos. Bullets shredded the leather-bound books, sending fragments of paper flying through the air like winter snow. Arthur shielded Elena with his own body, his arms wrapped around her so tightly he could feel the frantic, terrified drum of her heart against his ribs. The physical contact was jarring. In the heat of battle, his year-long vow felt like a distant memory, replaced by the raw, primal need to keep her breathing. "Stay low," Arthur hissed in her ear. His breath was hot against her skin. And despite the terror, Eleanor felt a strange, surging jolt of electricity. He was a wall of muscle and heat, a monster protecting his only treasure. Arthur waited for the lull in the firing, the 3 seconds it took to reload. In one fluid, lethal motion, he rose and fired back. His movements were precise, devoid of hesitation. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the apex predator of the city. Within seconds, the two intruders were down, and the library returned to a heavy, ringing silence. He turned back to Eleanor, his hands trembling as he reached for her. He pulled her up, his fingers digging into her shoulders. His grey eyes were wild, searching her face for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt? Look at me, Eleanor. Are you hit?" I'm fine," she stammered, her voice shaking. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the blood on his sleeve and the cold fury in his gaze. But she also saw the terror. For the first time, the King of London looked vulnerable. He didn't let her go. Instead, he pulled her into a darkened alcove behind the bookshelves, his back against the wall as he listened for more intruders. The space was cramped, forcing their bodies together. Elena's chest heaved, her breasts pressing firmly against his leather jacket. Arthur's hand slid up to her neck, his thumb resting against the frantic pulse in her throat. The adrenaline was a dangerous catalyst. The fear of almost losing her had stripped away his defenses. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips, which were parted in a silent plea. The tension from the fireplace the night before rushed back, magnified 100-fold by the proximity of death. "I told you I was a monster," Arthur whispered, his voice jagged. "I told you this world would find you." "You saved me," she breathed. She reached up, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw, tracing the stubble that had grown over the long night. The contact made him shudder. "Arthur, look at me." He looked, and in that moment, the obsession he had felt since seeing her at the bar transformed into something far more terrifying. It wasn't just that he hadn't touched a woman in a year, it was that he never wanted to touch anyone else for the rest of his life. The promise he made to his mother on July 20th, 2023, finally made sense. This was the love that made a man feel human, a love so intense it felt like a wound. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled in the dark, a shared, desperate rhythm. His hand wandered down her back, tracing the curve of her hip through the thin fabric of her dress. The heat between them was suffocating, a silent explosion of need. He wanted to mark her, to hide her inside his own skin where the bullets couldn't reach. "I won't let them take you," he vowed, his lips brushing against her temple. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let a single hand touch you." "Arthur," she started, her hand sliding into his hair, pulling him closer. The moment was interrupted by the heavy boots of his own security team entering the room. "Clear, the house is secure," Elias shouted. Arthur pulled back, the mask of the cold gangster slamming back into place, but the crack in his armor was visible to Elena. He straightened his jacket, his eyes lingering on her for one last hungry second before he stepped out into the light. "Elias," Arthur said, his voice cold as ice. "The Valentis didn't do this alone. They had help from the inside. Someone knew the bypass codes for the library wing." He looked around the room, his mind already calculating the betrayal. He didn't see the way one of his junior guards avoided his gaze, nor did he see the man subtly checking a notification on a burner phone. Arthur turned to Eleanor, who stood among the ruins of the library. "Go to the secure vault downstairs. Elias will take you. Do not come out until I personally knock on the door." "Arthur, be careful," she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. If he spoke, he feared he would tell her everything, how he loved her, how he feared for her, and how he was losing his grip on the world he had built. As Eleanor followed Elias toward the reinforced basement, Arthur stood in the center of the library, surrounded by the scent of her perfume and the iron tang of blood. He knew the war had only just begun, but he didn't realize that the real betrayal wasn't coming from the front gates. It was already standing right behind him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the only thing he finally cared about. By the late afternoon of November 16th, 2024, the Sterling estate had been transformed into a fortress. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and the metallic tang of dried blood. Arthur moved through the corridors with a cold, lethal efficiency. He had spent the last several hours interrogating the survivors of the attack, but the answers he found only led to more questions. He led Elena down into the bowels of the house, where the reinforced vault waited. It was a room designed to withstand a siege, filled with enough supplies to last for weeks. But as they stood before the heavy steel door, the space felt small, the air thick with the unresolved electricity of their encounter in the library. "I have to go," Arthur said, his voice a low vibration in the cramped hallway. "The rat is still in the walls, Elena. I can't protect you properly until I know who opened that door." Elena looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dim overhead lights. The fear from the attack had settled into a quiet, simmering intensity. She reached out, her fingers catching the lapel of his leather jacket, pulling him toward her. "Don't leave me here," she whispered. "Not like this." Arthur groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated torment. He stepped into her space, his hands framing her face. His skin was rough against hers, but his touch was as light as a prayer. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool air of the basement. The year of isolation felt like a heavy shroud he was finally ready to burn. "I am doing this because I cannot lose you," he murmured against her lips. He didn't just kiss her. He claimed her. It was a desperate, hungry collision of two souls who had been starving in the dark. His mouth was firm, tasting of scotch and fire, and Elena met his intensity with a fervor that surprised them both. Her hands slid up his chest, feeling the frantic, powerful thud of his heart, while his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly until she was flush against him. The friction was intoxicating. Through the layers of their clothes, she could feel the heat of him, the hard lines of his thighs and the overwhelming strength of his embrace. He trailed his lips down her throat, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, making her gasp and arch her back. For a moment, the vault, the guards, and the looming war disappeared. There was only the weight of him and the scent of the storm clinging to his hair. Arthur pulled back just an inch, his eyes dark with a possessive fire. "Wait for me. Do not open this door for anyone but Elias or myself. Do you understand?" "I understand," she breathed, her lips swollen and red. He stepped back, the loss of her warmth feeling like a physical blow. He watched her enter the vault, the heavy door hissing shut with a finality that made his chest ache. He turned to the two guards standing watch, men he had trusted for 5 years. "If anything happens to her," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion, "don't bother pleading for your lives." Arthur climbed back to the main floor, his mind already miles away, calculating the location of the Valenti hideout. He spent the next several hours in a blur of violence and interrogation across the city's industrial fringe. He found the traitor, a middle manager in his shipping firm who had been bought for £50,000. But as Arthur stood over the man in a rain-drenched alleyway, the realization hit him like a freight train. The attack on the house hadn't been an assassination attempt. It had been a test of his response time. "Who else?" Arthur hissed, his boot pressing into the man's chest. "Who else is on the payroll?" The man coughed, blood flecking his lips. You were so busy looking at the gates, Sterling. You forgot to look at the shadows." A cold dread settled in Arthur's gut. He didn't wait to finish the job. He sprinted back to his car, pushing the engine to its absolute limit as he raced back to the estate. The drive felt like an eternity. By the time he skidded to a halt in the driveway, the sun had long since vanished, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. The front doors were wide open. Arthur drew his weapon, his boots thudding against the marble as he ran toward the basement. He found the two guards he had left at the vault. They weren't dead. They were unconscious, their own stun batons discarded nearby. The vault door, the one designed to be impenetrable, stood ajar. Arthur stepped inside, his heart stopping in his chest. The room was empty. The silk robe Elena had been wearing was draped over the chair, looking like a discarded skin. On the small table in the center of the room lay a single crumpled photograph, Elena as a child, with her brother. On the back, written in a cramped, ugly hand, were 3 words: "The debt is paid." "Elena!" Arthur roared, the sound echoing off the steel walls. There was no answer, only the hum of the ventilation and the distant mocking sound of the London rain. He fell to his knees in the center of the room, his hand clutching the silk robe she had left behind. The scent of her, vanilla and rain, was still there, a cruel reminder of the woman he had finally allowed himself to love. In one night he had broken his vow, found his heart, and lost everything. The silence of the house was broken by the vibration of his phone on the cold floor. It was an unknown number. He answered it, his voice a ghost of its former self. "Sterling," a voice rasped, the elder Valenti, "you've kept your hands clean for a long time. But now you're going to find out what happens when you let someone matter more than your empire. She's beautiful, Arthur. I can see why you broke your promise for her." "If you touch her," Arthur whispered, his eyes turning into shards of ice, "I will make sure you pray for death for 1,000 years." "Come and get her then," Valenti laughed. "But bring your crown. You're going to need it to buy her life back." The line went dead. Arthur stayed on the floor for a long moment, the darkness of the room swallowing him whole. He looked at the silk in his hands and felt the last remnants of the boy his mother had raised wither away. The monster was all that remained. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't call the police. He didn't call his associates. He walked to the hidden compartment in his wall and pulled out a heavy black case he hadn't opened since 2021. The year of peace was over. The year of the vow was a memory. Arthur Sterling was going to war, and he was going to burn the city to ash to bring her home. The rain on the morning of November 17th, 2024, was a cold, grey sheet that blurred the line between the sky and the dark waters of the river. Arthur Sterling stood on a rusted iron catwalk overlooking a derelict warehouse on the city's industrial edge. He was dressed entirely in black, his silhouette blending into the shadows of the rotting brickwork. In his hand, he gripped the heavy steel of a weapon that hadn't seen the light of day in 3 years. He didn't have an army with him. He had Elias and 4 of the most loyal men he owned, men who knew that if they failed today, there would be no tomorrow. "The girl is in the central office," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They have 8 men on the floor, 2 at the door. Valenti is waiting for you to walk through the front gate." "Then we won't use the gate," Arthur replied. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, stripped of any humanity. The assault was a masterclass in silent violence. Arthur moved through the shadows of the warehouse like a ghost. He didn't hesitate. Every movement was a calculated strike, a reflection of the year of discipline he had lived. One by one, the Valenti sentries fell into the darkness, never seeing the man who took their breath. Arthur felt nothing, no guilt, no fear. The only thing tethering him to the world was the memory of Elena's voice and the scent of vanilla that still lingered in his mind. He reached the heavy steel door of the central office. Inside, he could hear the low, mocking laughter of the elder Valenti. "You think he's coming, sweetheart?" Valenti's voice carried through the door. "Arthur Sterling doesn't risk his crown for a girl he found in a bar. He's probably back at his estate right now, counting his losses." Arthur didn't wait. He kicked the door off its hinges with a surge of strength that felt like it could shatter stone. The room exploded into motion. Valenti's men reached for their holsters, but Arthur was faster. He was a blur of black leather and cold steel. Within seconds, the 3 guards in the room were on the floor, and the only sounds were the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors and the drip of rain from the ceiling. Arthur ignored the elder Valenti, who stood frozen behind a desk. His eyes were locked on the far corner of the room. Eleanor was tied to a chair, her chestnut hair matted with sweat, and her white dress torn at the shoulder. Her eyes were wide with terror, but when they landed on Arthur, the fear transformed into a desperate, shining hope. "Arthur," she choked out. The sight of her, the bruises on her wrists and the tear in the dress he had bought for her, snapped the last thread of Arthur's control. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand closing around Valenti's throat before the man could even utter a plea. He lifted the gangster off the floor, his fingers digging into the flesh with a strength that turned Valenti's face a dark, bruised purple. "I told you," Arthur hissed, his face inches from the other man's. "I told you what would happen if you touched her." He didn't kill him. Not yet. He dropped Valenti like a sack of waste and turned to Elena. He pulled a knife from his belt and sliced through her bindings with a single, fluid motion. The moment she was free, Elena collapsed into him, her arms wrapping around his neck with a strength that nearly brought him to his knees. "You came," she sobbed against his chest. "I will always come for you," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. He lifted her into his arms, his large hands supporting her weight with a tenderness that defied the violence he had just committed. He walked out of the warehouse, ignoring the chaos of the police sirens in the distance. He carried her to the black SUV waiting in the shadows, and for the first time in 2024, the weight in his chest felt like it was lifting. They didn't go back to the estate. Arthur drove to a small secluded property he owned on the outskirts of the city, a place no one knew about. As they entered the small stone cottage, the silence of the countryside was a balm to their frayed nerves. Arthur set her down on the edge of a large, comfortable bed. The room was dim, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. He began to check her for injuries, his hands trembling as they mapped her skin. He traced the bruises on her wrists with a reverence that made Elena's breath hitch. "I'm okay, Arthur," she whispered, reaching up to cover his hands with her own. "I'm here." The contact was electric. The adrenaline of the rescue and the relief of being together created a volatile, intoxicating heat. Arthur looked down at her, his grey eyes burning with a fire that had been suppressed for 366 days. The promise he had made to his mother, to only touch a woman when his heart was leading his hands, was no longer a burden. It was a destination. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was desperate, deep, and filled with the truth of his feelings. It wasn't just desire. It was a surrender. Elena pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body arching toward his. Through the thin silk of her dress, Arthur could feel the frantic, rhythmic heat of her skin. He slid his hands down her back, the friction of the fabric against his palms creating a slow-burning fire. Every touch was a discovery, a year's worth of longing channeled into the curve of her waist and the softness of her thighs. He trailed his lips down her throat, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "I love you," he groaned against her neck, the words sounding like a confession and a vow. Elena gasped, her hands sliding under his shirt to feel the hard, rippling muscle of his back. "I know," she whispered. "I love you too." They stayed there in the shadows, two souls finally finding their rhythm after a year of silence. The physical connection was staggering, a shared language of heat and skin that made the rest of the world feel like a dream. Arthur held her as if she were made of glass, yet with a hunger that spoke of a man who would never be full. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon on November 18th, 2024, Arthur lay with Elena in the quiet of the cottage. The war wasn't over. There were still accounts to settle and a city to stabilize, but as he felt the steady rise and fall of her chest against his, he knew he had already won. He had kept his promise, and in doing so, he had found the only thing worth keeping. The winter of 2025 arrived in London with a clarity that the city had not seen in years. The biting winds of January 2nd, 2025, had swept away the suffocating fog, leaving the skyline sharp and silver against a pale blue morning. At the Sterling estate, the scars of the November breach had been repaired, the marble replaced, the glass reinforced, but the atmosphere inside was fundamentally altered. It was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a home. Arthur Sterling stood on the balcony of his master suite, buttoning his charcoal-colored shirt. He moved with a grace that was no longer stiffened by the tension of a year-long isolation. His grey eyes, once compared to storm clouds, now held the depth of a calm sea. The power he wielded over the city had not diminished. If anything, his strike against the Valenti family had solidified his position as the undisputed sovereign of the London underworld. But the crown no longer felt like a weight of lead. He felt a soft movement behind him, followed by the familiar intoxicating scent of vanilla. Eleanor slid her arms around his waist, her cheek pressing against the small of his back. She was wearing a thick, oversized cashmere sweater that belonged to him, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his shirt. "You're thinking again," she whispered, her voice a warm vibration through his skin. Arthur turned in her arms, looking down at the woman who had redefined his existence. The bruises on her wrists had long since faded, replaced by a glow of health and a quiet, fierce confidence. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with a tenderness that still made Elena's heart skip a beat. "I was thinking about the first night," Arthur admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "How I saw you standing by that bar and felt like the world had finally stopped spinning, just so I could catch my breath." "You were terrifying that night," she teased, though her eyes were filled with love. "A giant in a high booth, watching everyone like they were chess pieces." "I was a man who was starving, Eleanor, and I didn't even know it until I saw the feast." He leaned down, his mouth meeting hers in a kiss that was slow, deep and thick with the history of their journey. There was no longer the desperate, jagged edge of the rescue mission. Instead, there was the steady, rhythmic heat of two people who knew they belonged to one another. He pulled her closer, his hands sliding down to her hips, drawing her flush against him. The contact was electric, a shared language of touch that they had spent the last 2 months perfecting. They moved back into the room, away from the chill of the balcony. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, pulling Elena between his knees. He took her hands in his, looking at them with a solemnity that made her breath hitch. "I never told you the full truth," he said softly, "about why I waited." "You said it was a promise," Elena reminded him. "It was more than that. On July 20th, 2023, when my mother was taking her last breaths, she looked at me with so much pity. Not because I was losing her, but because I had everything a man could want, money, power, influence, and yet I had nothing that mattered. She knew my father had spent his life consuming women like fuel for his ego, She made me promise to stop, to be still, to wait until my heart was the one making the choice, not my blood or my pride. He looked toward the portrait of his mother that now hung in their private sitting room. I thought it was a punishment at first, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a low hum. I thought 365 days of silence would make me stronger, harder. But then I saw you, and I realized the wait wasn't about building a wall. It was about making sure that when the right person finally arrived, I had the space inside me to hold her. Elena reached up, her fingers brushing the dark hair away from his forehead. She was a wise woman, Arthur. She knew you better than you knew yourself. She knew that a man like me, a man who deals in shadows, needs a reason to seek the light. You are that reason, Eleanor. He stood up, towering over her, his presence filling the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn piece of paper, the same note he had found in the vault the night she was taken. He walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the embers. They watched together as the remnants of the betrayal and the debt were consumed by the flames, turning into harmless ash. The consequence of his actions over the last few months had been heavy. He had lost men he thought were brothers. He had seen the depths of his own capacity for violence. But as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that the cost was worth the growth. He was no longer the boy his mother had raised, nor was he the monster the city feared. He was a man who had found his balance. Later that afternoon, they walked through the streets of London. They didn't have a security detail trailing them in blacked-out cars. Instead, they moved through the crowds near the South Bank like any other couple. Arthur held her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, his thumb occasionally rubbing against her knuckles. The city felt different to him now, less like a battlefield and more like a canvas. As they stood by the railing of the Thames, watching the dark water flow toward the sea, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. The year of the vow was over, but the discipline it had taught him remained. He understood now that true power wasn't the ability to take what you wanted. It was the strength to wait for what you deserved. "What happens now?" Elena asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Now," Arthur said, looking out at the city he had conquered and the woman he had won. "We live. We don't just survive. We build something that isn't made of stone and iron." The story of Arthur Sterling would be told in the pubs and the boardrooms of London for decades to come. The legend of the gangster who stopped the world for a year just to find his heart. But for Arthur and Eleanor, the legend didn't matter. Only the warmth of the hand in theirs and the promise of a tomorrow that wasn't dictated by the past. The journey of resilience is never a straight line. It is a series of choices made in the dark, fueled by the hope that the light is waiting on the other side. Arthur had found his light, and as the sun began to set over the city, casting long golden shadows across the water, he knew that the vow had not just been fulfilled, it had been surpassed. True strength is found not in the iron of a fist, but in the courage to remain soft in a world that demands you be hard. And as long as he had Elena by his side, Arthur Sterling would be the strongest man in London.